Hi, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Again, I'm Amy Talbot, the Water Efficiency Program Manager at the Regional Water Authority. And today I'm going to give us an overview of, I'm calling California's new era of water efficiency. So for those that aren't familiar with the Regional Water Authority, we're a group of about 20 public and private water suppliers in the Sacramento region. You can see here on the map kind of broadly where we reach. It's really all the way from Sacramento all the way up into the foothills. Our suppliers serve about 2 million people, and I would say we're essentially a membership association with the water suppliers. We do a variety of activities: water supply planning, water efficiency, which I manage, and then advocacy and legislative work. We also try to do a lot of collaborative projects that make sense for us to do as a group rather than individually. And we administer a large amount of grants on an annual basis. So that's kind of just a broad overview of what we do. So just to dive in, I wanted to give us an overview today of the past, future, and present of water conservation and water efficiency. We'll start with where we were, and that's the 20 by 20 legislation that I know some of us are familiar with. I'll talk about where we will be, what the new laws that just came out say and what they mean, and what I believe will be a new era for us in the state as far as water efficiency. Specifically, we'll go over the supplier-specific water budgets and updated planning requirements that are involved in the new laws. And then I want to give an idea of where we are now, which is in a state of progressing, preparing to implement these new laws. So I put it here as, think of it as the ghost of Christmas past, present, future. As we walk through, that's how it's kind of in my mind, and hopefully that'll help us frame as we go through. And my favorite version of that, in case anyone is wondering, was the Scrooge version with Bill Murray. So to get us started where we were, that's the 20 by 20 legislation, also known as Senate Bill X7-7. This was a statewide call to reduce 20% of urban use by 2020. This was for all urban retail water suppliers through the state. Individual supplier reductions varied. So an agency could have technically a 16% reduction, another agency could have 20% reduction, but collectively, when all those agencies add up, there's a 20% reduction statewide is the goal. This legislation had mixed reviews. On the good side, folks really like the ultimate flexibility of how to reduce. So you just had a % reduction, and it was up to each individual supplier on what they chose to do to reduce. On the bad side of the mixed reviews, % reductions, because it didn't account for their previous efforts, and it didn't account for cost effectiveness. They felt like they were just giving a % reduction based on their baseline in gallons per capita per day. So some agencies like this legislation, some did not. So that's why I say it's mixed review. And the deadline to meet this regulation, the 20% reduction, is the end of this year, December 31st, 2020. So it's rapidly coming up. And suppliers report their compliance to this legislation in 2015 at the 2020 or the 2015 mark, but also in the 2020 urban water management plans as the final decision, did you make it or not? So that's also coming up. These plans will be due in July 1st, 2021. So you might be wondering to yourself, where are the suppliers in the region in relation to the 2020 target? So you can see here by supplier, you can see their baseline GPCD, which is where they're starting. There was a midway point to meet the 2015 target. And as you can see here, I didn't put the targets in because all of the water agencies met their 2015 targets. As a reminder, we were in a severe drought at that time, so there's no surprise there. So where are we now? With the 2019 gallons per capita per day, you can see the column there of where agencies were as of last year's data and what their 2020 targets are. And next column, and then the column on the far right is a difference between where they are in 2019, as of 2019, and where they need to be at the end of this year. And as you can see, the vast majority of agencies are well under their targets. Those negative numbers mean the numbers that they are under their target. So overall, our region is doing extremely well meeting this regulation, and we anticipate that all agencies will meet it in 2020 by the end of this year. So another way to look at this gallons per capita per day metric, which has been used in the past as something to follow to say, how are we doing with water efficiency? You can see those individual supplier numbers that we just looked at rolled up at the regional level here. So what you're looking at now is GPCD gallons per capita per day are in the bars. You can see that steadily declining over time. The yellow line represents population. So you can see the population of our region is growing over time. And then the blue line is water use as a region. You can see that's fairly steady over time with some dips in 2015, 2016, as we knew with the drought. So this does a really good job of showing, why GPCD is declining. So you've got an increase in population met with a pretty steady water use. That means when you do the math that you're going to have a declining gallons per capita per day metric. Another way to look at this, if you want to see the numbers, these are the numbers for the previous chart. So you can see that here, we're right around 2 million people. Our gallons per capita per day metric in 2019 was 173. But I also want to draw your attention to the little box to the right. So during the drought, the State Water Board came up with a separate metric that's related but different. And this is residential gallons per connection per day. Or per capita per day, excuse me. And the difference between gallons per capita per day and residential gallons per capita per day is that in gallons per capita per day, it's all water use, all sectors, commercial, businesses, schools, everything divided by the population. Whereas R-GPCD, residential gallons per capita per day, is only the residential sector of water. So that gives you a more honed in idea of how many gallons an actual person is using, because it's only using residential use. So you can see those numbers start in 2015, and you can see that they're quite a bit lower than the GPCD. And this really gives us a better idea of how many gallons an average person is using. So in 2019, the R-GPCD was 115 versus the GPCD, including all sectors, in 2019 was 173. So you see the difference between those numbers. Another way to look at this is to look at it across time and across a year. So in the last slide, you just see this number, 115, as just a single number, but really it's an average over all the months over the year, an average number per day. But when you look at it over time, you see that 115 doesn't really represent every month. So you'll see here the use in January, February, March, November, December. Agencies on par are well below the 100 gallons per person per day. That really spikes up in the summertime, where you see those numbers double or tripling in the summertime with the heat and everything that goes into what's driving water use. So I don't want you to look at that 115 and think that's every day static over time. It's really a little bit more complicated than that. And it's because of our water use patterns, because of what's happening in the region. So I just wanted to give a little clarification that it's not a simple number, just one time number. It is kind of moving with time. So another way to kind of roll up those gallons per capita per day is to look at our monthly water production over time as well. And as you see, it has the same curve as the gallons per capita per day, which makes sense. So in January, February, March, you're seeing a lot lower water use as it warms up. You're seeing that hump in the summertime, and it goes back down in the fall. So that same curve is really in line with the precipitation and temperature data that we have here, just alluding to the fact that our water use is really driven by these external factors. So you can see here with the lines, those are the average temperature and also the 2019 temperature every month. And then on the sides there, you see the precipitation patterns. So you notice that when we have rain, we have a lot less water use. When we don't have rain in the middle in the summertime, we have a lot more water use because we're making up for that outdoor watering. Just another factor besides precipitation and temperature that also feed into this one number, this R-GPCD or GPCD. It's actually a lot of factors that go together. And I just wanted to bring in another one just to round out our discussion. So it's not just precipitation, temperature, but also have to do with land coverage. And here you can see the difference between tree canopy and East Sacramento and Meadowview. So when you have areas that are covered with more landscape, there happens to be higher water use there, but also higher levels of shade and community and other factors that go into rounding out what makes a community's water use. So not only is the gallons per connection per day not the same during every month, it's also not the same for every community. So that's a little bit about kind of where we were and the metrics that we are tracking in the past. And I wanted to flash forward a little bit to see where we're gonna be. So I know a number of us, when the new conservation regulations were passed, you might have seen some of the media that was out about it. And so I wanted to start with what it is not, what this new regulation is not. So here's a quote that was widely publicized when these new laws were passed. And it says, to make a long story short, now that these bills are law, it's illegal to take a shower and do a load of laundry in the same day because you'll exceed your ration. So this kind of spread like wildfire all through the state of what these new laws mean. And I'm here to say that this is absolutely not true, and this is not what the laws do at all. So in case you're wondering, I just wanted to put that to rest. It's actually a lot more complicated than this, but it definitely is not handing out rations. So what exactly do the new laws do? So the two laws are Senate Bill 606 and Assembly Bill 1668. And even though they're separate bills technically, we need to think of them as one bill because they're completely interrelated. And there's text in one bill that talks to the text in the other. So from going forward, just think of them as the water efficiency bills or the conservation bills collectively. Both of these bills were signed by the governor on May 31st in 2018. The purpose of these two bills was to establish long-term water use efficiency and conservation metrics for the next era, for the next step after the 20 by 2020 legislation sunsetted. So that's one of the things it does. It also has terms in there that I think will help better prepare California for droughts and climate change in the future, and that gets to some of the planning metrics. And these two bills were really based on Governor Brown's executive order that was released during the drought. And so that's how I've kind of organized the discussion for us. So within that executive order, there were 4 primary goals. I'm going to talk to the first one, which is use water more wisely, which establishes the water-based budgets for individual water suppliers. And also I'll focus on goal number 3, which is strengthen local drought resilience. This really gets to the planning metrics that we're talking about. So let's start with goal number 1 though. So goal number 1 establishes water supplier-based water budgets, but it also only applies to certain water suppliers, and those are the larger ones. They're called urban retail water suppliers. These are private or public suppliers that deliver water directly to either 3,000 users, 3,000 connections, or that they supply 3,000 acre-feet of potable water or more. So these are the larger of the agent suppliers in the state, and this is the target audience for this piece of legislation. An example of an urban retail water supplier is the city of Sacramento or Sac Suburban Water District. So now that we know the target audience, who is not the target audience? This goes back to that quote in the beginning. The target audience for these regulations is not an individual person. It's not individual households or individual businesses, industries, or institutions. It really only focuses on the water supplier. So this legislation does not have any personal goals for any one person, business, household, or anything like that. It's only at the supplier level. So before we get too far into the budget discussion, I just wanted to get a couple terms that I think will be useful for us to have, to use during the discussion. And the first is the standard. And this pertains to the water budget. So as we're developing what this water budget is, there's a thing called the standard, which is the equation or method used to calculate the volumetric estimates of the objective of the goal or target. So an example of that is the indoor standard that it will be rolled up in the budget is 55 gallons times the population. So the standard is the way to get there. And then the objective is the term used in the regulation, and that is the volumetric estimate of aggregate water use calculated from those standards. There's 4 of them, and I'll get to them in a second, for each urban retail water supplier. So the objective, think about this as the water use budget or target, and the objective is a volumetric estimate. So that would be 555 million gallons. So the standard is how you get there with the equation. The objective is the target in volume, the volume of water. Okay, so how do we calculate this, methodological water supplier budget? What does that mean? There are 4 specific parts that there will be a standard for each of these 4 parts: indoor use, outdoor use, water loss, and CII, which is commercial, industrial, institutional landscape. And then those standards will be calculated into volumetric numbers, and then all of those numbers for each 4 of these will be added up to one supplier target at the end, one big number. And then that is what the agencies have to meet. So the budget is trying to be fairly comprehensive. So you can see it's covering indoor, outdoor, water loss. And when we say water loss, we mean water loss from water systems, not individual households. And then again, the CII landscape. So with this, we've got a broad breadth of what water use is for the suppliers. And now I'll go into each one of these standards to give you a little bit better idea of what we're talking about. So the indoor standard is the standard for indoor residential water use, and that's 55 gallons per person per day multiplied by the population of the service area multiplied by 365 days. So that's the standard, and then you will get the volumetric target after that. There's an important distinction here is when agencies first start doing these calculations, they'll be using 55 gallons, but it's set in the legislation that this gallons per connection per day number will reduce to 52.5 after 2025 and 50 gallons per capita per day after that, after 2030. So it is kind of a sliding, decreasing scale over time, with the idea that as a state, we should be getting more efficient as time moves forward. This 55 gallons, you might be asking, well, how did we pick 55? How did that happen? 20 legislation. You'll see here the text below. One of the options was to calculate a water budget to meet that. And that's where the 55 gallons per capita came from as the base for this new regulation, for this new standard. Now we've got the outdoor standard, the next step in the budget. And this standard is for outdoor residential water use, and it's based on a community's climate and the amount of landscape area. So essentially what happens is the state will be using aerial imagery. They'll look at all residential landscape areas. Those landscape areas will be measured via aerial imagery in a very complex algorithm. And then an agency will get a certain number of square feet, you know, say, this is not right, but 1,000 square feet of landscape area. Then that landscape area will be added to a calculation that incorporates a local climate data, so evaporation rates and efficiency, irrigation efficiency rates as well. And then all of those things will be calculated together to get a volumetric allowable outdoor water use. This is a very, very complex process, and we're in the middle of that working with DWR now. An important point with this is that it's not just irrigated area, it's irrigated plus other areas that may be irrigated in the future. And DWR is terming this irrigable. It's a really awful word to say, it does not feel good to say it, but that is what they are calling it. So think of irrigable as currently irrigated and areas that also could be irrigated in the future within that residential parcel. And again, it's not an individual household, it's all those houses, all that house landscape area rolled up to a supplier level. So it's, you have to think local and then roll it up to water agency perspective. So another important thing about this standard is that the allowable water, in theory, that is allowed for a resident here will be different than the amount of water, the same square footage that is allowed, let's say, in San Francisco, because there are different climatic factors. And that's one of the benefits of this new framework that we're working with now, is that it is trying to be more locally specific, as opposed to 20 by 2020 that was seen as more high level and not agency specific. Okay, the third standard is the water loss standard. Again, this is not for individual households. This is for leaks within a supplier's system. This standard also is accompanied with another piece of legislation called Senate Bill 555. This accompanying piece of legislation requires annual validated water loss audits, which basically is an accounting system for how much water your system, your supplier system is thought to be losing over time. These annual reports are submitted to DWR. There's a lot of metrics within this report, and some of those metrics are being used now to establish what is known as the water loss standard, which is an allowable amount of water loss. So it's essentially taking these audit reports and then adding regulation to some of the inputs that are in there through an economic model to assess cost effectiveness. We think that the standard that's going to come out of this is going to be expressed in gallons per connection per day of water loss. So this is kind of in line with the gallons per capita per day. So same sort of, not same sort of, but similar outset. This one is also very complex. I could talk about this for probably hours, but I won't. So the last one is the commercial, industrial, and institutional landscape. So this sector has been split into what I'm calling the volumetric part of this sector and the non-volumetric part. So the part that's going to be included in the budget along with indoor, outdoor, and water loss is essentially a water budget for large landscape accounts with dedicated irrigation meters. So these are, you know, city parks, school outside areas, industrial park outdoor places. So like larger commercial buildings that have outdoor areas that are on their own separate meter for outdoor water use. And then that water use in that land area will get a similar landscape budget to what is happening in the residential world. So it's like a commercial budget for these larger landscapes, and that will be added in with the outdoor water use from residential as well. So That takes care of, let's say, the outdoor water use for the commercial, industrial, institutional customers, but also there's a non-volumetric side of it. Because what about, you might be asking yourself, what about the indoor use for these sectors? How is that going to be accounted for? And this is a little bit more tricky. This originally started to do a similar budget-based approach like the outdoor, but was switched to performance measure-based because of the complications. So some of the conversations that happened were, how do we budget for restaurants, hair salons? What if you have one hair salon with 2 chairs, but no one ever goes there? They have 1 client a month. Or what if you have that same salon with only 2 chairs, but there's people in there, 8 hours a day, always occupied? That water use is going to be a lot different than the hair salon with only 1 chair active once a month. So it's really hard to assess what a business's water budget could be because it's so dependent on a lot of different things. So in order to try to help progress water efficiency and the indoor side of things, the state is coming up with best management practices by sector, or practices to follow. They're also considering some additional rules like thresholds for converting mixed commercial meters to dedicated irrigation meters. So some places will have indoor and outdoor all metered together, but there could be a threshold in which it makes sense to split that up. So then you would have 2 separate meters, and then that dedicated irrigation meter would be added into the volumetric part of this. There's also talk about standardizing the classifications of some commercial accounts in supplier databases. So agencies will have a better idea of, what types of customers they have. So aligning that with a standard that will be done statewide. And then this item is still kind of up for grabs and up for discussion. So a lot of these metrics for the non-volumetric for the indoor commercial use are not set yet. Okay, so now we have a little bit of information about all the 4 parts. How do they go together? So I'm going to use an example for us to walk through of how this will actually work. So for indoor use, let's say supplier X, whoever we're working with, does a calculation, does their standard. They come up with a volumetric saying, okay, my indoor use, my budget, my allowable budget is 1 million gallons. Then they move to outdoor use. They go through the standard, do the measurements, talk to DWR, it comes out. So outdoor use, you have 3 million gallons. Then you go to the water loss standard and you're like, okay, I'm doing my audit, I'm going through this economic model, how many allowable gallons do I have for that? You have 10 million gallons. And then you go to the CII, you run the standard, you get your volume, you get 1 million gallons. So then you add all of those up, indoor, outdoor, water loss, CII, and this supplier's unique water budget is 15 million gallons. So that's the amount of water that you can use in 1 year as a water supplier. So then the legislation has also allowed for variances. You have your budget calculated, but specific things might be impacting how water is used in your service area. So let's say you have a lot of evaporative coolers that use a lot more water than the average household in the state. So the state's allowing suppliers to apply for variances to get a little bit more water in their budget to account for things that water suppliers don't have control over, which is how many people use evaporative coolers. There's also going to be a bonus incentive for potable reuse of water, and that's for up to 15% of the objective. So those are kind of the 2 on the end of after you calculate your budget, what can also change some of those numbers. So then you go to kind of wrapping it all up to one. Step 1, you go through, you make your budget, you say, I have that 15 million gallons. Step 2 is, do I have any variances or any incentives that I need to incorporate into that budget? If the answer is no, then you go to step 3. And step 3 is for the water supplier to go back and look at their meter data for these 4 areas, indoor, outdoor water use, or water loss, CII, And then you add up all that meter data and you say, okay, all my meters say that I've used 14 million gallons. So then step 4 is I've used 14 million gallons. My target is 15 million gallons. That means I am 1 million gallons under my target. And then therefore the conclusion is this water supplier is under budget / in compliance with this new metric. An important distinction here is that suppliers do not have to meet each target exactly. So like if your indoor use target is 1 million gallons, but your actual use in indoor is 1.5 million gallons, that's okay, because you can be underused, in another area, and then adding everything up, you're still under budget. So you can be over budget in one area, but under budget in another, and still reach compliance. So what's the timing for all of this for suppliers? So things have already started. We've started the standard development in 2018, and we're in that right now. We're still developing the standards. In 2022, the state has been instructed to adopt all of the formal standards so that we can move forward. So everything needs to be done by 2022. In 2023, agencies will calculate their objectives. And that means going through what we just did with the whole process of adding all the different areas together, and then looking at their meter data, and then assessing if they're on track or not. And in 2026, all agencies have to reach their objectives or face enforcement. So here is a more detailed version of that last slide for timeline. I wanted to draw your attention to the enforcement bar here on the far right. So enforcement does begin before 2026, but it doesn't get into monetary fines until 2027. So you'll see in 2023, when agencies are first calculating, that's the first year they calculate their target. If they do not make it, the State Water Board can issue informational orders. In 2024, they can issue written notices, and in 2025, they can issue conservation orders. It hasn't really been set exactly what is involved in each of these, but we know that as time moves forward, they will increase in severity if you're not meeting your target. And then it will end later in 2027 with the start of a monetary fine for up to $1,000 a day for not meeting. Okay, so that wraps up the water budget, that first goal that we talked about. Now I want to talk about the third goal here, which is the more planning related goal. And this really focuses on urban water management plans. But before I go into what this new regulation means for those plans, I wanted to step back and give us an overview of exactly what urban water management plans are. So who has to do these plans is the urban retail water suppliers, the same agencies that are involved in all the other regulations that we've discussed. When does that happen? It's every 5 years. And so the next one is for 2020, but is not due until 2021. So all the planning years, basically plans are due in years that end in 0 or 5. And then those plans are due essentially 6 months after that end of that year. So what is an urban water management plan? You can see here, these are the 4 tasks from DWR's, sorry, I'm coughing. These are the 4 tasks from DWR's website of what is required in an urban water management plan. So it's really a reliability document to assess a reliability over a 20-year planning time frame. It talks about demand management measures, which are conservation efficiency measures, and a water shortage contingency plan, which is essentially an action plan of if an agency needs to reduce water use. It's an action plan. It basically says, I need to reduce my demand for this service area by 5%. Here are the 3 things I need customers to do. And then it'll increase in severity over time. So let's say, at the beginning of a drought, we only need 5% difference. but it can go up to 20, 30, 40% reduction with actions on that same side coming up more severity. So in the beginning, it's like, okay, you can only water 2 days a week now. But when you need a 40% reduction, you may not be able to water at all. So it's basically an action plan to reduce demand in response to a shortage, whether that be drought or an emergency or something like that. And that's what's a water shortage contingency plan. So that's included in the urban water management plan. That's one component of that. It's also, these plans are also used to report progress to the 20 by 20 goal that we discussed earlier. And they have to, in like the 2015 plans, every supplier had to put an update of where they are with this, with the 20 by 20 regulation, and they'll do the same thing in 2020. So that's another purpose. And then the plans have to discuss the use and planned use of any recycled water. So it's a high level planning document is really what it is. And those are submitted to the state. So I just also wanted to say what these plans are not. These plans are not detailed master plans. They're not demand forecasting plans. They're not modeling results. You know, all of that can be fed into these plans, but these plans themselves do not do that. They're also not infrastructure plans. They don't talk about where and when to replace pipes. They don't talk about where and when to start a new treatment center. Like, none of that is the focus of what this is. They're also not a conservation or efficiency plan. Those are separate. Urban water management plans talk about conservation and efficiency actions. They don't necessarily plan for them. Okay, so in light of these two new regulations, what is in store for these urban water management plans is a couple of things. And I like to call it like enhanced or drought planning plus, or, think of it as the next step. So these plans were already in place, but with these regulations, now suppliers are being asked to do more than they have previously. One of the main things is that in urban water management plans, they have to do a drought risk assessment. Basically, like if I have dry years for 3 years, what would I do? Well, now that 3-year planning time frame has been increased to 5. So now suppliers need to consider what happens if I have 5 continuous dry years. What happens if I have, in addition to what happens if I have 1 dry year. So basically the severity of droughts are being increased into the planning mechanisms of these plans. Also, those water shortage contingency plans that we talked about in the past, agencies will have different percent reductions for different numbers of stages. So most agencies will have, 1 through 5, 1 through 6 stages. But like one agency, stage 1 might be a 5% reduction. Another agency, stage 1 might be a 10% reduction. And we found this a lot during the drought, that it was hard to communicate on a statewide basis and a regional basis, because stage 1 in these plans meant something different to a lot of different agencies. So what this regulation has done is, see the chart here below, has basically standardized it. So now every supplier has to follow this setup, but the difference is that individual suppliers can, they can make up their own actions. So they still decide what is going to get us to that 10%. So that's individual, but the framework is not. The framework is going to be standard across the state. So now in future droughts, when we say stage 1, it's going to mean a similar stage number and a similar percent reduction, which I think is a great thing.
Amy Bennett here, just a quick heads up, you're sort of approaching the 10-minute warning mark that you wanted.
Okay, thank you.
You need to go a little longer, don't worry about it. But
okay, thanks. And so there's also a couple of new topics that will be covered in these plans as part of the regulation. And now agencies are going to do a little bit more work for climate change, and also need to submit water energy related data. So energy use associated with delivering water is going to be included in these plans now, if that information is available. The DWR guidance hasn't been released for these new topics, so we don't know exactly what agencies are going to have to do, but we know there's going to be additional work in these couple of areas. There's also going to be enhanced reporting as part of the regulation, and this will apply to wholesalers as well as retail water suppliers. So there'll be a whole host of new reporting requirements. The regulation for monthly reporting was adopted in 2020, and this will continue reporting on production and conservation metrics into the future, as was done during the drought. Agencies are also going to have to do an annual water shortage assessment in 2022. For those that are familiar with what happened at the statewide level during the drought, this is similar to the stress test. This basically asks agencies, you know, what's your anticipated demand for this next year? What are your anticipated supplies? Are you able to meet it? If yes, that's great. If no, what are you going to do about that? What stage of your shortage contingency plan are you going to have to trigger in order to make those meet? So that will be annual assessment suppliers have to submit starting in 2022. And then of course, they're going to have to report on the urban water use objective on their water budget every November beginning in 2023. So where are we now with all of this? With all the new regulation and you know, where we are right now. So there's a lot of things happening at the state level. For the indoor standard, there is a statewide study to investigate if the current standards are appropriate, and they need to report back to the legislature. You know, is 55 gallons the right number? Is it 60? Is it 40? We don't know. And so that's what this study is trying to figure out. The city of Sacramento and the city of Folsom are involved in the indoor study, so we do have a lot of regional representation. For the outdoor standard, the state's conducting ongoing pilot studies and analysis to refine these landscape budgets. So they're constantly reviewing and improving how they're measuring this landscape area and how they're going to be calculating outdoor water use, allowable outdoor water use as a result of this. And luckily, City of Folsom is also involved in this study. So again, we have regional representation. For the water loss standard, the formal rulemaking process for this standard is expected to begin in September. However, it has been ongoing for about 2 years now, in, I would say, the informal process. And this really revolves around the draft economic model, which is a model that's used to produce the water loss standard for each agency. And those targets have been released and they're being reviewed by water agencies. And of course, there's ongoing work group meetings and comment periods with all of these standards as we move forward, and will be over the next couple of years. So where are we now as far as RWA activities on these standards? For the indoor, RWA has $100,000 in grant funding to study indoor water use and fixture saturation. You know, do we have a lot of potential still in this region with older fixtures? And where is that? Right now, we know that there's a lot more potential in lower income areas and areas that are, you know, like apartments that are being managed, where a person is not the owner, where they're not upgrading those fixtures. So that's what we focus some of our direct install programs, where we go into those communities and replace the toilets for them with grant funding. You know, how much more potential is there is what we're trying to find out. For the outdoor standard, RWA has a landscape budget pilot program with a local consultant called Land IQ. This involves 5 suppliers, where we're trying to get a handle and do a small amount of landscape water budgets within these 5 supplier areas to get an idea of what's likely to be the landscape budget. Are we likely to meet those? And if not, what can we do about it? So we're trying to get a little bit ahead of what the state's going to be doing, to have our own information to be able to help us understand this element a little bit better. We're also partnering with UC Davis to study various irrigation efficiency approaches. They have a student, it's a student program where they have out a lot of different plots of different grass and and they're associating a lot of different controllers and irrigation equipment to try to test out what's working, what's not. You know, how much water does that plant need? Is it healthy at this level? And then they are going to have drones that fly over and take like ET measurements, stuff I don't really understand, but I'm excited to see what's going on and what the results are. Then there's, we have a lot of staff members on the technical advisory work groups for the state, including myself, to continue to work with the state to develop the standards. Then for water loss, RWA has a lot of leadership roles in this area. The Cal Nevada AWWA Water Loss Committee Chair, Aqua's water loss lead, and we've been meeting with State Water Board members, with RWA members to provide examples to give our feedback on what's happening with water loss. And of course, I just wanted to mention that we have our regional water efficiency program that's been ongoing for the better part of 2 decades now. That involves 19 suppliers within the region. You can see here our annual budget. The main thing that we do with this program is a public outreach campaign. You can see our website here, bewatersmart.info to the right. We also do school education and professional landscape trainings, but I won't touch on those today. The main thing we do with this campaign is we come out with a call to action and key messages every year. The last couple of years, our primary call to action has been the best way to know if your yard needs water is to check the soil's moisture level with a meter, screwdriver, or by digging down. And we tested this at a couple of focus groups and found that people really, they really dug it. They really enjoyed doing this. So this is something that we want to continue to do. And so we take our research that we're getting from these focus groups on how to engage with people, and we turn them into ads. And then we promote these on Facebook. We have them online. We have them on Google. But you can see here the whole concept of, are you overwatering? Does your yard really need to be watered? Or can you wait another day? So here we have the gnome here, you know, needing some help in the yard because there's too much water in it. And then the one to the right is our ad for this year. So you can see last year's and this year's. So we try to have a funny one, and then we have a straightforward one. The straightforward one is check the soil and save. A moisture meter tells you if your yard needs water. So that way, you know, if we can draw people with humor, great. If we can draw people in with just straight facts, that also works too. And then this year we added leaks to our package of what we're trying to communicate. So here you can see the average running toilet can waste 200 gallons of water per day. That's enough for 600 dog baths every month. And then we'll do kind of add-on materials with that. So we have this static ad, but then you'll see to the right that we've made it into a leak detection tablet flyer that we hand out to agencies where you can test your own toilet to see if it's leaking. So, you know, the regional program is just another element to help us implement these regulations. So, you know, one is obviously doing the background work of, you know, working with suppliers, make sure you're meeting your budget, doing the calculations. But the other part is communicating all of these goals to the public. And that's where I think we can use the regional campaign in the future. It is what it is now, but I think at some point it might be reimagined to better align with, you know, implementing these two regulations. So I just wanted to wrap up, and then I have a couple more slides, but I just wanted to wrap up with some challenges I see with implementing these regulations. The first is there's still a lot of unknowns at this time. You know, the only standard that's set is the indoor right now, so there's still a lot of standards to be set. I think there's a lot of uncertainty of, will supplier, you know, where are we at with the budgets, and will suppliers have to increase their staffing and budget in a lot of different areas, program infrastructure and maintenance, to meet the new regulations over time. And there's also a question of how will the state enforce these budgets, knowing this is a new thing and it's probably likely to take like a number of years for agencies to get used to implementing this, and will there be some grace in the enforcement periods? A question I ask myself is, since this is the first time we're doing these budgets, what if California is already relatively efficient? What if we go through this exercise of, putting together these budgets and the results are, we're actually, some of us are already efficient. So what do we do then? What does the state do then? There's also changing water trends that I'm noticing. So in the past, you have fixture replacement that's fairly passive. You just replace the fixtures. People are going to flush the same amount of times. But if they flush with a toilet that uses less water, you get some savings. Well, that law that was setting up those new toilets was passed nearly 30 years ago, and the replacement for all those toilets is kind of coming to an end. It's not just toilets, other fixtures. So I foresee us moving forward to get the savings that we've gotten in the past. We're going to have to be a lot more active in what we do. Then, as we can see outside right now, there's going to be climate change impacts. We don't know exactly what those are, but we know they're going to be there. Then there's the idea of layers of regulation that are happening. So it's not only this water conservation and efficiency legislation, it's water quality regulation. It's, maybe climate change regulation. So water agencies are working now with layers of regulation that kind of support in some ways, but also force agencies to prioritize. I also wonder about state staffing capacity. For example, like the 2018 water loss audits have not been returned to agencies as approved yet. That was nearly a year ago. Now the 19 budgets are done now. If we can't keep up with the current regulations, how will state staff be able to meet the very complex regulations that we're walking into right now? And then of course, there's the media and customer communication, like the quote that I showed earlier. How will we manage what we need to do and how will we communicate that? So finally, my 2 cents, what I think these regulations will do. I think they're going to increase awareness in the state for water efficiency, which I think is a good thing. I think it'll motivate agencies to reevaluate their efficiency goals and programs, which I think is a good thing. I think it'll foster new relationships at all levels, which I think is also a good thing. I like the drought planning initiatives that are in the regulations. I think that's the strongest part, in my opinion. My question is, will the effort that is needed to meet these be worth the savings and the benefit? There's a cost benefit ratio. How does that work out for agencies? And will agencies be forced to do things that are not cost effective? That's what I'm wondering. I believe water efficiency is great, but it's not grand. And by that, I mean, it's wonderful in a lot of ways, but it's not everything. It's part of a package that water agencies are responsible for. And it's part of holistic water supply planning. So is it wonderful? Yes. Is it everything that needs to happen? No. And then I guess there's going to be a lot more meetings is my other conclusion. So this last slide I think sums up my whole presentation, which is the devil is in the details, and it remains to be seen how this will be implemented.
That's great, Amy. Thank you very much. It was a really thorough briefing. We have, 15 minutes-ish for questions that folks may have for you. So let's open it up and invite folks to turn their cameras back on if they're not already on. And either raise a virtual hand or throw something in the chat. And I will note that Paul Helliker noted a while back when you were going through the stages that suppliers don't have to use these standard stages, but they can use their existing stage, but then they have to translate from their existing stage and show how it correlates to the new stages.
Yes, that's correct. You can fit your own stages into that template, but you have to fit it in there in some way.
Great. Good. Well, let's go to questions, and I'll note a couple of kudos to you in the chat on a good presentation. Jim Pfeiffer, and then over to Greg Zlotnick. Jim.
Thank you. I hope everybody enjoyed Amy's presentation. It was really well done. Amy, thank you very much. Amy only had a limited amount of time, and I wanted just to add something, and that is we have a program in the RWA that some of our member agencies are involved in, which is we're looking at the outdoor water landscape sort of algorithms and data, and we're doing some things to sort of truth test this and also gain some familiarity. Amy's been leading that effort for I think like 2 years now, and this is good for two reasons. One is as the state rolls something out, we are better informed consumers of what that product is, and we can respond back to the state if we see some problems within our region. The other thing, though, with this program is many of our conservation managers like that because they will be able to tailor their own individual agency programs and have that information and be able to utilize it if there's someone who may be overwatering. That's all I have.
Thanks, Jim. Greg.
Actually, Jim answered.
Now we got you. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jim actually covered. Is my hand raised down? It didn't seem to give me the unraised hand.
It's down. It's down already. No worries.
Okay.
Great. Let's see if anyone else has questions. I do have a question, Amy. I was curious, are you all seeing any impacts from COVID in any of the sort of water use trends?
So that's something that one of our agencies, Sac Suburban Water District, Greg Bundenson, has been doing some, I think, informal research on this, and he's going to be presenting, I think, in the next month or so on his findings. So we'll have a detailed understanding, at least from one agency, of what's happening. But generally what I'm hearing is that there's not so much of an increase in water use as much as a shifting. So it's,
right.
You know, it's less commercial use, more residential use, but not so much, you know, not so much like a rapid increase. It's just, you know, again, people are flushing the toilet the same number of times. They're just at a different location. So.
Okay. Thanks. Clyde. You're on mute, Clyde.
Yeah, just a perspective, my perspective on kind of what the legislature has been doing is the legislature, and this is my opinion, I guess, that the legislature perceives the water situation in California is that we're running out of inexpensive water. And we've kind of over allocated too much water to things. I mean, what Amy has talked about today is all about the water supply, but, you know, sort of, well, all right, an agency may have enough water and you pull out the water out of the American River, but the American River doesn't have enough water. And we're not kind of bringing those kinds of things into it. I think there's a lot of opportunity on things like sprinkler controllers. You know, most of my neighbors, I bet most of my neighbors, you know, set their sprinkler controller once and they never look at it again. And most of them are stupid. They turn on and, you know, they turn it on and they turn it off in the beginning of November and they turn it back on in March, and it waters the same amount every week, every day. It's the same thing over and over again. And I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think the other one is, you know, we're looking at water budgets, but, you know, ultimately we're going to have to start looking at, you know, what is the budget for? How much turf do you have? Trees don't use that much water, but turf uses a lot. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And another thing, just kind of on my walking around and observing things, and for quite a while on my neighborhood, there were a couple neighbors who turned their sprinklers on every single night, and they ran, and I would wake up, you know, you could go out at 11 o'clock at night and run your kayak down the gutter. And, you know, we could pick those people off. It's, you know like this, you know, other than the city of Sacramento, and the city has now with water meters, they know how much water people are using. You know, you could put that together with how many square feet do you have in your lot and kind of go, hey, why are you 3 times more than you ought to be? And, you know, so I think there's opportunity there. But a lot of the state stuff is looking at, you know, what are the districts doing? But I think ultimately we're going to have to get down to what the consumers are doing. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Clyde. Just to follow up on a piece of Clyde's comment, Amy, I'm just curious, to what extent do the statewide standards sort of take into account, or how do they take into account landscaping decisions? you know, what people are putting on irrigable land.
So those are largely left up to planning departments. And so that's outside the scope of this legislation. It really, I mean, obviously they're related and it's hand in hand, like Clyde was saying, you know, like if you have different landscape ordinances that allow certain types or don't allow certain types, then that will influence water use. The landscape budgets, like they basically, right now it's irrigable and irrigated land. The budgets that we're getting done through Land IQ do distinct between grass and shrubs and trees, and are applying different plant factors, water use factors to each of those to try to give a little bit more detailed budget. So we'll have a better understanding of what plant matter does to water use. But the state's budgets are going to be rolled up in a higher level than that, is what's
Thanks.
happening now.
Great. Ted, and then over to Barbara Leary. And Ted, you might be on mute. Ted, are you there? Let's go to Barbara, and then we'll see if we can get Ted back online. Barbara.
I wanted to address the issue about the landscaping watering, because it was really problematic when people, and I'm not complaining about people going to the lower, but a lot of people, at least out here in Folsom, have converted to lower water use landscaping and then had irrigation or landscaping companies install drip systems which are not supplying enough water for the trees. So a lot of trees have been lost over the last 3 to 4 years and not replaced. So my problem with I guess it's difficult to educate the public, but my problem with that is that now we have more heat islands out here than we had 5 years ago. And I suspect that may be the case in a number of regions in the county. And another part of that is that the Sierra Club's been trying to partner with some organizations in the EJ communities in South Sacramento to add trees. So there's kind of a conflict in how we're trying to reduce heat islands and increase green spaces and then telling people not to water. And I'm not sure if there's any solution that's workable on that. It's an ongoing educational problem.
I 100% agree with you, Barbara, on that. I think it's going to be an ongoing education issue. It's something that we also experienced during the drought and had a lot of tree loss, is communicating, like, how do you reduce water but also maintain a healthy landscape? And that's something that the program focuses on now, is not necessarily just use less water point blank. It's like have a healthy landscape, and that means watering efficiently. I mean, you can hurt plants by overwatering and underwatering, and that's the message we're trying to get across now, is that you need to deliver the right amount of water, and that's why we have the moisture meter to try to get people to hone in on, don't just water when you think you need it or when you don't think you need it. It's you need to check and make sure you're applying the right amount of water. And outdoor watering is going to be our focus. It has been and will be in the future, because the majority of the water we use in the region, in the residential sector especially, is outdoors. So it's something that is just going to have to keep at it. And it's part of the reason we do the focus groups, is to try to better understand what people are thinking about watering and why they do what they do, to try to help with our messaging. you know, and the city of Sacramento is a city of trees, and I noticed a lot. I live in the city of Sacramento. I noticed a lot of tree death during the drought, now actually a year or two after even. And it's one of the things that prompted me to work closer with the Sacramento Tree Foundation, just to help with messaging. And now RWA, I'm on the board with them to try to make sure that the messaging that we get out at RWA is in line with what the Sacramento Tree Foundation is also recommending. And we have a couple of joint videos that we put out together. We coordinate with their staff to try to make sure that the tips we're giving out are appropriate. So I think it's a little bit more coordination between groups and then just continuously talking with customers.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Greg because I don't see Ted in the mix. He must have had to drop off. But Greg Zlotnick.
Excuse me. Thank you. Thank you, Barbara, for that comment. Unfortunately, I think I'm a victim of this issue with trees, and drip isn't enough. But I wanted to get back to Clyde's comments, and I don't disagree with you, Clyde. I think you made all very good points about, you know, potential. My question is, do you believe that that is something that is appropriately addressed within this discussion, the Water Forum 2.0, or is it really more dealing with, as Amy said, the local land use issues and sort of what we can do in our conservation programs to be more targeted, perhaps, on the things you raised?
I don't. Well, personally, I think that, you know, we're going to need to do conservation, and I don't see why we don't. If, you know, in sort of what the Water Forum is all about is trying to make sure that we meet the two goals. How do you protect the river? How do you meet the water supply needs? So, you know, water conservation is one of those tools. And I think the development community that wants to build more houses was also interested in water conservation, because if they run out of water, they're not going to build houses. So I think there's a lot of reasons for wanting to do things. I mean, I think what Amy described as what the state is doing, and it's a lot of the rationale for what state is doing, what the legislature did, is to try to figure out how do we say how much water conservation, or how much water can the people in San Francisco use versus the people in LA or San Diego or Redding or someplace like that. And so they're trying to answer that question, but I still think a lot of it gets down to individual water users and you know, how we do things.
Thanks, Clyde. I want to get
again. I don't. I'm sorry, but so the requirements that we are now facing because of the new legislation, which Amy described very well, that is, from your view, it sounds like not irrelevant, but it almost sounds irrelevant.
Well, if I can jump in, I think where the questions you're posing, Greg, I think are the kinds of issues that we need, you know, working groups to be thinking about and sort of reflecting back on, you know, say, for example, the interest statements that each of the caucuses shared, because I think if we think about sort of the program that Amy's laid out, and then have an opportunity to think about those in the context of the kinds of interests the different caucuses are looking to advance through this conversation, I think that will be a good way to sort of come at that question and try to understand where's that overlap, where's the productive conversation to be had. I want to get a couple other people in, again, just these sessions being an opportunity just for us to see what's on people's minds. So I think it's helpful to hear. Let me get Ann in, and then Rob, and then I do want to see we have a phone in the mix ending in 8011. That might be Ted. We are short on time, so folks can be focused. Rob, you're up.
I think you mentioned the other. Okay, I'll ask my question. Two parts. Amy, of the water districts in the Sacramento region, how many of them fall below the threshold for the water budget law?
How many, well, all but 2 RWA members. Is that
Are
the
within.
question? Are within, right. So
Yes.
Rancho Murrieta is under 3,000 connections, as well as Del Paso Manor,
Okay.
but everyone else is subjected to the new laws.
And what about non-RWA members? Where does that stand?
Like smaller systems, or are you talking about statewide?
Well, are there any larger systems that are non-RWA members in the Sacramento region?
I mean, like City of Davis, City of Woodland.
Well,
City
I'm
of
thinking
Galt.
more of in the traditional sphere of the water forum area.
Maybe City of Galt, Amy?
City of Galt and Rio Linda.
Okay, so
they're the
there are a
2
few.
larger area or agencies that are under the legislation that are not RWA members.
Okay. Then the second question I had is related to the urban water management plans. We had done some preliminary analysis of the various urban water management plans that have been adopted in the area. And it was frustrating because they take considerably different approaches in some ways, making it difficult to compare and aggregate data to get a good regional perspective based on urban water management plans. Has that been a challenge or an issue for RWA? And do you see room for greater standardization, greater consistency in the way data is presented and organized so that it is more comparable from the larger perspective of the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always opportunity for more standardization. I know the current plans have standard tables that agencies have to put their data in for ease of comparison. Is that kind of what you're referring to? Or are you talking about the data itself, or the text around like their approaching to planning?
How it's organized, how it's explained, and is it presented in a way that's comparable from one, in terms of water supply, water rights, those kinds of things. Water rights in particular is a very confusing area to try to understand what agencies' water rights are, what they're using, what their priorities, seniority, and being able to kind of pull all of that together in any kind of an understandable regional sort of way.
Jim Pfeiffer, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Rob. And so here's my observation of it. The answer to that question with respect to urban water management plans is no for the RWA. There have been times that we've needed information to do planning that the members wanted us to do, and we've aggregated that. Sometimes it comes out of the urban water management plan. Sometimes we ask them directly. We haven't had the need to look into people's water rights or things like that in the way that maybe the environmental caucus members have been interested in doing that. I will also just sort of say that often there's a consulting firm who puts these urban water management plans together, and they all have just sort of a different way of organizing that information. And I think that's part of what you might be finding too. It's just sort of the thought process. I'm going to stop there to see if you have any reaction to that.
Jim, this is Tony, and I wanted to see if I could augment it a little, but I'd certainly like to let Rob react to what you said maybe first, just to be polite.
Yeah, I mean, that's good to hear that, of course, you're working with a lot more data than we are and a lot more understanding. And these plans are supposed to be accessible to the public and are supposed to be tools for developing a common understanding of each water district's water agencies' approach to conservation and all the other issues of water delivery. So I think, from my perspective, that there is the opportunity for an improving consistency and relatability between them. And the question is, how could we achieve that if there's agreement that there is room for improvement?
Sure. Rob, but before Tony also jumps in, I want to make a disclosure. There has been some of our member agencies that would like to see some common chapters in urban water management plans. And Amy is actually leading an effort to do that. It hasn't gotten very far yet because the state has not produced the guidance document for preparing urban water management plans. But there's been actually a recognition by some of our members that maybe, and it's coming from a different vein than I think you're asking, but there's some perhaps efficiencies that can be gained by having common chapters for the RWA member agencies. And I just wanted to say that. That's not necessarily where all the RWA member agencies are, but that impulse is coming from some of them. Tony, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. I just, as a person that's...
Sorry, I just jump in and note that we need to wrap up in by 10:30, and I want to get one or two other people in, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. Then I will make this very brief. I've done our PCWA's urban water management plans several times, and so I have some experience. And I would just offer that the water supply side of urban water management plans is on the extreme of there really isn't a standard. Everybody's water rights are unique. Every water supply contract, every water right is written with its own rules. And so it would be the most difficult part of an urban water management plan to try to standardize. I'll throw out another bookend though. The other side of urban water management plans that are very standardized is on the water demand side. There's a parameter called GPCD. I'm sorry I was late if Amy maybe already covered it. That is extremely standardized. And you could sit there and list that parameter one against the other, and it's pretty much apples to apples.
Thank you. Ann Singer.
Thank you, Bennett. So Amy, thank you for the presentation. I did just have one question, which I'm sure I should know the answer to, but does the economic model that the state is contemplating take into account affordability issues when we are sort of investing in our systems to an extent that could affect rates? I honestly just don't know.
It does not, is a simple answer. It basically does a cost-benefit ratio, but does not do the extra step of, and in order to implement this, you would need an increase in budget by this much, and that would be this impact on rates. So it stops short of that type of analysis. Inherently, it's supposed to be cost-effective to be built in there, but currently as is, it does not function properly in this area. And that's one of the main issues that we're having with the state right now.
So can I just ask one follow-up? So when you say cost effective, you mean cost effective for the agency or cost effective for the customer?
It's supposed to be cost effective for the agency and employ full life cycle cost accounting is the exact language from Senate Bill 555. And currently it does neither of those things properly.
Thank you.
Ted Rao, are you able to hear us? And if you are on the line, did you have a question from before to jump in? Okay, Greg?
I'm sorry.
Hey. No, go ahead.
Yeah, so number ending with 8011, if that's you, Ted, you need to hit *6 to get off mute. Sometimes that's elusive.
Okay, thank you. I did try *6 a number of times. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Just a few quick questions, and I apologize for the delay. On charts 7 and 8, when you look at the January, February time frame, that might be a good approximation for indoor use, which is around 50 GP. I'm wondering if that is a fair interpretation of that data, since it seems to show that when people turn off their exterior water, that's about what they're using per person.
Yes, I mean, the simple answer is we really don't know how much water people are using inside versus outside when they're metered together. There's some technology now like Flume that's trying to get at that. And so in absence of that, we typically do kind of what you're talking about, Ted, is it's called the minimum month method, where you look at the lowest month of production and you can assume that all of that water is indoors, and that's kind of a proxy for indoor use. However, we know for certain that people are still irrigating even in that minimum month. And so, like for instance, when I did my thesis on this, using some of this data, I built in a 10% reduction even in the minimum month method to estimate indoor water use, knowing that even that month had some inherent outdoor watering in it. So yes, you can do that, but we still know that's not, it's not absolute, but it's the best we have sometimes in the absence of having technologies like Flume or dual metering or something like that.
Well, that seems to argue that the state's perspective of 55 gallons dropping to 50 may not be that severe in terms of a standard going forward. In fact, based on your numbers, it may be expansive and we may be able to do better in this region. I'd like to switch to one other question because I know we're running short on time. But slide 29, and I guess this gets back to the general question that was raised about whether the Water Forum needs to be involved in this area. When I looked at that and I saw the characterization of the urban water management plans not doing a lot of things, and one of the concerns that raised for me is that in an earlier conversation, we've made the point, or the point was made, that local planning agencies are directed toward those plans for them to be able to make the correct decisions on future growth. So it seems to me if they are not aggressively taking into account climate change, water demand, water supply, answering those kinds of questions effectively, then local planners are not going to be able to make the correct decisions either.
Bennett?
I'm like, do we have time to respond?
Bennett?
Yep.
I want to make sure that this comment or this question is going to the right recipient. And I think that comment or question is actually being directed to the Water Caucus in general and not to Amy.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mike,
good clarification.
I could give it a go if you really wanted me to, but
I think for sake of time, I think that's a great question to sort of leave it where it is. It's obviously something that we're going to have many more focused conversations on. But Amy, if you want to give a 30-second response.
Well, I'm like, which question? I do think that it's important for planning agents. I used to actually be an urban planner before I had this job, so I do have some experience in this. And planners do incorporate a lot of different materials. Not every state has urban water management plans, but I think it's also on the onus of both planners and water suppliers to work together to talk about what materials are needed and what resources are available, not just to defer to one thing or another because it's state regulated, that they really should be working closer together, in my opinion, but that's probably overstepping my reach at this point. And then as far as the indoor water use, looking at that graph is probably oversimplifying it. And then a lot of different communities have different reasons why their indoor water use might be higher or lower. You know, age of fixtures, things like that matter. And also it's really hard to make a conclusion of what exactly is indoor water use just looking at that chart. And that's why the state has gone and is doing a further study with a team of experts known nationwide and actually internationally to be able to tease out what actually is indoor water use. So even though that chart looks very simplistic, it's a more complicated topic.
Okay, we really do need to wrap up. We're about 50 minutes in overtime, but that's because this is an important topic and a really thoughtful presentation. Greg, I know you had your hand up before. 30 seconds.
Yeah, and I sort of got a little bit more from the last comments, but not to put too fine a point on it. I just want to be clear. What I'm hearing is that the response to Amy's presentation is, in essence, it seems to me, from those that we were trying to make sure we're educated about what is before us as agencies, is that, well, that's nice as a state standard, but it doesn't go far enough for our region in all probability, and we should be willing to discuss doing more and have that discussion as part of Water Forum 2.0. Am I interpreting that correctly from our friends in the Environmental Caucus, or am I overstating it?
Not necessarily from my perspective in terms of doing more, in terms of conserving more, but better coordination and better consistency among efforts among the various agencies. I think it's an open question about whether more is appropriate.
Thank you. You're muted, Bennett.
Thank you. It's only fair that I do that too. I'll just add that thanks, Rob, for weighing in with that, and I'll note that there may be folks on the phone who there may be diversity of opinions, and we'll just have to explore that as we go forward. Amy, thank you tons for an incredibly thoughtful presentation. Really, really well done. We are off schedule. I'm going to reconvene us at 1/4 of. We do have a few minutes cached here and there in the agenda, so I think we'll be fine. But let's be back at our desks at 1/4 of. Okay. Again, Amy, thanks very much for that.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
And let me remind folks, we will start up with the NSC meeting. And again, anyone on the phone is welcome to be participating in that as well. it.
Even two.
Okay, we're going to get going here in about 30 seconds or so. And folks can turn their videos back on.
I'm back. Ron Stork.
Great, thank you. Good.
Ron is camera shy.
I am on. Can you hear me?
Yes,
we
is that
can.
you, Ted?
Yes, it is.
Yep.
I'm not camera shy. My internet connection went out about half an hour, 45 minutes ago.